Call me Frater N. It's not the name my mother gave me. It's the one the corridors used when they learned my steps. I was ordained in a summer of unthreatening light, the kind that lies politely on marble and never asks where the shadows go at noon. They told me silence was a sacrament. No one said it was also a scaffold. If you need a date for the record, write down the feast of a saint who no longer has a feast. Yes, choose one of those. You'll find them in the margins of old calendars, a name rubbed to a soft ghost by centuries of thumbs turning pages. Write the name, then cross it out with a single stroke, like a clock hand laid over the face. I didn't intend to trespass. I was trained to carry books, not to open them. The first oath I ever kept perfectly was to the index, the belief that everything has a place, and that a thing in its place is a kind of holiness. But the Vatican teaches you something else if you stay long enough. The map is devout. The territory is only occasionally obedient. There are stairways that only know how to go down. The one I found was less a staircase than a throat, narrow, cool, swallowing light. I met it behind a service door, south transept, a corridor that seemed perfectly satisfied with being seldom used. A hairline in the plaster breathed. I pressed. The wall yielded the way old bread does, reluctantly, then all at once. Smell is the first historian. Ink and iron, damp wool, the faint, metallic sweetness of dried blood you only recognize because you've bitten your lip in winter. The light from my pocket lamp did that thing. How can I say it? The thing where it stops being a tool and starts being an opinion. It kept changing its mind about how far the hallway went. There are rules for movement in sacred spaces. Don't hurry without a purpose. Don't linger without a text. I broke both. Don't. The tiles changed from the gentle mania of Renaissance geometry to something older, dark basalt, flecked as if with old planets. My soles learned to walk quietly, and my mouth learned to agree. On the left, a chained lectern, its book sealed in black wax, stamped with a device I didn't recognize, a circle so dark it swallowed the light in its ink, ringed by 12 thorns, each pointing inward, converging on absence. On the right, a wall cut shallow with lines like veins. I raised the lamp, a star map, but there was no north. The constellations were reversed, the way a face looks when it admits the mirror is telling the truth and the world is lying. At the end of the passage, a space opened like a held breath, finally allowed to join the world. No gilding, no frescoes. A chapel assembled out of refusal. The floor was a disk of that same basalt, polished to the clarity of a midnight lake. Inlaid in its center, a perfect, light-drinking circle, the black sun bound by that thorny ring. Above the altar, a clock hung without hands. The numerals were Roman, I through 3, but not evenly spaced. They leaned, slightly, toward the center. As if gravity had chosen a different allegiance, I said a prayer that felt impolite in my mouth and stepped closer. The lectern's book, not the sealed one, no, a second volume, smaller, bound in cracked leather, the color of rain-dark wood, shifted. It didn't open. It exhaled. A pulse of cool air found my cheeks. The wax seal on the chained tome gleamed like a closed eye refusing to dream. If you came here for melodrama, I'm sorry. The devil did not appear. No choir sang in a language that wounded. A door simply was, and then so was I. The first voice I heard in that chapel was not a whisper. It was paper, A page turned itself somewhere I couldn't see. The sound wore a century like perfume. Then the smell came: parchment, animal glue, and that copper note I told you about. If you've never smelled old ink that was once alive, I can't give it to you. There are sacraments language cannot administer. I left. Of course I left. I backed out the way a man steps away from an ocean he's realized is also a mouth. In the corridor, the air changed back to honest stone and slow dust. The service door closed with the shyness of a secret. I promised myself I would not return. I made it as far as the piazza before the bells found me and, by ringing the hour, told me what time it would be convenient to forget. That night, inventory called me like an alibi. In the Archivum Secretum, we say we preserve to prevent rumor from becoming scripture. We tie books to lecterns, not to imprison them, but to give them the dignity of weight. I signed out a pair of folios, hagiographies, and a missal with marginalia so careful it bordered on tenderness. The ledger accepted my initials. The keys approved my face. Down in the reading room, I met Marta, conservator, Jesuit-trained hands, eyes that made dust confess. "You've been quiet," she said. "Silence suits you when it's not wearing chains." I showed her a slip of paper, a rubbing I'd taken from the chapel's star wall, merely a handful of lines I pretended were architectural. She looked, and for a fraction of a breath, the muscles at the corner of her mouth forgot their job. "Mirror script," she said too quickly. "A palimpsest over its own face. We get them sometimes, books that learn to read themselves from the other side." She returned the paper like a person returns a warm coin to a fountain. "Leave it, Frater. We don't mend reflections. We mend what casts them." We agreed to tea. This is how conspiracies begin among people who would rather not have them. When I arrived at the colonnade, 2 men stood with her, wide apart like parentheses enclosing her name. Their collars were not clerical. Their smiles were clerical. The taller one addressed my shoulder. "Curiosity is a luxury we cannot afford you." The other one offered a different charity. "You serve the Church best by preserving her chronology." Chronology. The word didn't fit in the sentence. It fell through the floor and kept falling. I slept badly. Dreams came that were not mine. This happens when a building decides it owns you. I smelled the book before I saw it. The chained lectern's wax, warmed by a flame no one had admitted lighting. The next morning, I returned. Call it disobedience, if you want. I called it consistency with a truth I had already inhaled. The corridor accepted me with that same cool pressure, not silence, not sound. Something in between, the way water is between falling and river. In the chapel, the sealed volume wore a different seal, freshly impressed, still soft to the touch. The stamp in its wax repeated the black sun and thorns, but added a thin vertical scar down the center, the simplest of human inventions, a hand for a handless clock. On the unchained lectern lay a book I had not noticed before. How many times must I say that to be believed? The leather was blind stamped with a title whose Latin tasted medicinal on my tongue. Officium Solis Nigrantis, the office of the blackened Sunday. I did not open it. I read the rules. Every good liturgy begins with a rubric, red letters telling the bones how to move the flesh. In nights of no moon, it said, read the hours in reverse that memory may fall asleep. Where the calendar stumbles, smooth it with song. If a date awakens unrest, move it a day. If unrest persists, move it a week. What is sung backward unlearns its edge. I will not recite the prayers here. Prayer is a blade that cuts according to the hand that lifts it. I will tell you what the marginalia said. Cramped, ink-bled, centuries arguing with themselves in brown. Anniversaries are the lungs of events. Give an outrage no breath, and it will not carry. Shift the feast. The memory arrives late, and therefore alone. Alone, it forgets its name. You think this is melodrama again? You think I'm draping a cassock over the ordinary mischief of bureaucrats. But I haven't yet told you about the clock. The handless face above the altar was not blank. It was concave, a shallow bowl. The numerals were stamped deep enough to collect dust. When I lifted my lamp, the light pooled at the center, as if gravity had apprenticed itself to an invisible sun hiding in the dial. The room hummed, not loud, not theatrical, just present, the way a sleeping animal's ribs persuade the air. I reached for the sealed book. I am not proud of this part. The wax had been broken and resealed since yesterday. Another hand had already sinned here. My thumb found warmth where there should have been none. A small crack along the seal's edge released a breath of air that had been saving itself for centuries. Beneath the cover, the first page bore a warning that wasn't a warning. Not every correction is a cure. Not every cure leaves the patient alive. I closed it. I'm not foolish enough to read the dosage before I know the disease. In the days that followed, I behaved like a man who has discovered his veins are conduits for another person's blood. I did my rounds. I returned the folios. I signed the ledger in the places the ledger had learned to expect me. Marta walked past me carrying a reliquary with the same kindness she used on paper. We didn't speak. With some friendships, silence is a promise. With others, it's collateral. On the third day, a note arrived in my cell, a rectangle of paper with no handwriting I could accuse in a court. Just an embossed device, blind and clean, the black sun ringed in thorns. Beneath it, one sentence: "We keep what can be walked." It was the sort of sentence that looks wise until you introduce it to a map. I thought of pilgrim routes, lines that become prayers when repeated enough. I thought of saints with cities traveling behind their names like caravans. And I thought, for the first time, that a map might be less a record than a permission slip. I returned to the chapel at Compline, the hour in which monks invite the dark to inventory what's left of them after the day has had its share. The air was colder. The lamp stuttered. On the altar, a flat file lay half open, drawers shallow and wide as the gasp of a fish. I pulled one. Inside, charts, their vellum supple, edges rough-haired, pigments patient, the Mediterranean rendered as an iris, the Holy Land as a pupil. From the pupil radiated capillaries labeled with names I knew: Santiago, Rome, Jerusalem, and names I didn't. Roads that never existed, outside a mind that had the authority to make them real by drawing them. Tucked into the corner of a chart, a tiny stamp in black ink, the black sun partly veiled by a circle. Under it, a note in a hand I would have recognized, even if it had been ash. Marta's. We keep what can be walked. We forget what can only be imagined. You want a confession? Here is one. I was frightened not by malice, but by competence. To hate a thing is easy. To tune it its syllables, its anniversaries, its arrival in the human mouth requires love of a terrible conscientious kind. I traced a coastline that had been erased, not scraped, not torn, but soot darkened into a memory the parchment preferred not to entertain. In the corner, a list: relocate relics, reassign feast, retitle map, re-illustrate icon, if wing anatomy raises unrest. Beneath the list, a single line in red: when doubt persists, change the birthday of the doubt. I closed the drawer and found my hands had learned to shake. I placed them flat on the basalt disc in the floor, 12 thorns pricking the air above my palms. The stone was not cold. Something beneath it remembered Sunday. The handless clock gave a click that no clock is obligated to make. The numerals settled by a hair. In the corner of the room, dust lifted and considered a different gravity. I said a second prayer, this one less polite. It asked the room to accept that I knew what it was and that I would not pretend otherwise. I left again. I made it as far as the bronze doors before the Vatican at night pulled its usual trick. It became smaller. You don't navigate it then. You negotiate. I whispered Marta's name to the dark, as if it were a password I was allowed to spend. The dark returned me mine. Let me place a pin in the map for you, dear listener, the way a documentarian must. This is the part where a credible man calls a lawyer. This is where he delivers dates, names, codes on keys. I can furnish some of those later, but understand, if I give you proofs, you will learn to doubt the truth. In places like this, paper is only ever an accomplice. Stone is the witness. Write this down instead. The first rubric of the Black Sun office. On nights without moon, read the hours backward, that memory may fall asleep. Ask yourself who benefits when memory sleeps. Ask who sings lullabies to the centuries. Ask why the clock above the altar has no hands, and why, when you stand beneath it, your pulse begins to answer for them. This is my confession. I went back. And each time I did, the chapel behaved less like a room and more like a discipline, one that had perfected the art of moving history a day at a time until the day you needed could no longer find you. If you're still with me, we will walk that discipline together. In the next hour, I will show you how time learned to bow, how maps were told to forget, how a saint can be crossed out so mercifully that no one remembers the crossing. For now, hold one image, a handless clock humming above an altar no one admits exists, and a black sun on the floor that does not shine so much as cancel light around it. 12 thorns pointing inward, asking not, what time is it, but which time shall we keep? I learned in seminary that paper keeps a temperature. Fresh ink is warm, as if language still remembers it was once liquid desire, while vellum is cool, like breath held since the animal gave up its skin. The books I handled that week were neither warm nor cool. They were awake. I didn't call them that at first. No one wants to be the priest who mistakes anxiety for mysticism, but under the lamp, each page cast 2 shadows, one obedient to my light, and one late, as if governed by a sun that lagged a fraction behind ours. Tilt the margin, and the second shadow slid with a precision that felt personal. Copy a heading, and the copied words arrived on my page, a heartbeat, after my hand had moved on, like a child running to catch up with its name. Marta watched me notice this, and let the silence do the heavy lifting. Mirror script, she said at last, too practiced, like a fire drill recited to deny the smell of smoke, a palimpsest that learned to write back. She closed the folio carefully, palms flat, the way you calm an animal that has agreed for now not to remember its teeth. Night made the colonnades into throat and lung. Sound climbed and fell like breath. I stood too long in one place, and the decision that had been stalking me for days finally put a hand on my shoulder. I went back. The service door accepted my key like a confession it had been paid to keep. The corridor down to the chapel negotiated with my lamp, more politely this time. Depth yielded without argument, the way a locked jaw softens when the right name is spoken. On the unchained lectern, the Officium Solus Nigrantis lay open to a rubric titled, On the Care and Feeding of Hours. It instructed the cantor to sing the first line of matins as if swallowing it. Then, release each subsequent line one step earlier than the line before so that by the end, the beginning stood behind the ending, like a chaperone pretending not to be a guard. In the margin, a note in a thin, insistent hand recorded an experiment. Read backward. Events confuse their anniversaries. Grief finds no door. Joy forgets its coat. I put 2 fingers on the page. The parchment lifted to meet them, not because air moved, but because habit moved the deep reflex of sacred things to be handled. I ran the tests that make a conservator feel honest. Breathe to see if ink blooms. Weigh the page to suspect a scraped script. Trace ligatures to trap a century. Nothing misbehaved correctly. The ink did not bloom. It settled as if dust had chosen grammar. The page weighed as calfskin should, unless you measure the pressure it applied to breath. The ligatures belonged to no century at all. Each curve was a perfect rehearsal of itself, as though a hand had learned its letters in a mirror until it forgot the teacher. Between psalms, a narrow slip of parchment lay like a tongue hidden in a closed mouth. Anniversaries are engines. Do not fuel what you cannot steer. Footsteps tested the corridor. The chapel did its trick with distance stretching space until resolve runs out of stamina. No one entered. Solitude answered me in the tents of stone. Upstairs, the Libri vigils multiplied. Once you know the scent of anonymity, you smell it everywhere. A martyrology whose dates shivered when read aloud. A breviary where the rubrics read drifted shade by shade with the hour, as if the sun inside the ink were turning. A chain of sermons annotated in a precise, unembarrassed hand I recognized Marta's. Her notes didn't accuse. They measured. Moved feast 1 day. Unrest decreased. Moved feast 1 week. Unrest dispersed. Left feast untouched. Unrest organized. On the last sheet, her pen hesitated for the first time, ink gathering like a decision at the edge of a cliff. To erase is violence. To delay is mercy that forgets its victim. I took that line on my tongue like the host, and it dissolved with a taste of iron. We met in the bindery because the bindery is where lies go to ask for amnesty. Cloth tapes and bone folders, the sweet dust of paper fibers turning back into cloud. She kept her coat on. You've been assigned to folio intake because you see straight, she said, eyes on a stack of blank leaves. Don't curve. There are rooms built for curves. I offered her the star rubbing again. A few lines only. Courage rations itself when it believes someone else is counting. She didn't touch it. We keep what can be walked, she said soft now, like someone repeating a phrase to hear where it breaks. Everything else we let arrive late. So late it misses its train and finds a quieter town. Whose town? I asked. She smiled the way a teacher smiles when a child asks which saint owns which color. "The church is a calendar with a city wrapped around it," she said. "If we don't mind the trains, the city forgets how to sleep." Before I could ask how sleep differed from obedience, the two men from the colonnade arrived by accident or agreement. Doesn't matter. Their timing did. Their collars were properly nondescript, uniforms for people who only owe you adverbs. They asked after a folio I had not admitted to having and thanked me for the one I returned. "Chronology," said the taller, tasting the word like a key. "We preserve it," said the other, "so storms can be scheduled." I didn't answer. I had never considered whether the kindness of a forecast is also a form of control. I buried myself in work, a missile where the hours refused to hold still. At prime, the lines sat obedient. At terce, they slid lower by a fingernail. At sext, the margin crept like ivy. I copied a paragraph, left the book to fetch a brass weight. When I returned, my copied paragraph had become the original, and the original had organized itself into a commentary critiquing my handwriting. "The text reads you," Marta once said of Scripture. She hadn't meant it in a way that could be measured on a scale. So I kept a private index, names I would not say, dates I would not move, marks I would not file, a litany of small anomalies, gospel citations, switching tense when compared across editions, printed a century apart, feasts whose chants grew reluctant, the choir's pitch sagging like a tired rope, a marginal hand that looked like the main scribe had grown a conscience and stepped aside to watch what it had done. Everywhere, double shadows, the second light, the second time. The Black Sun office did not preach a grand theory. It trained muscle memory. It offered techniques like tools laid out on a cloth. If scandal grows teeth, move its feast to the season with too many mouths already. If heresy insists on a birthday, make it share the day with a great saint and let it starve in the shadow. If a map tells the truth too clearly, rename the coastlines after virtues. No one sails to patience. The waking books didn't argue this. They performed it. You could watch a date swerve one day to the left and feel the protest lose its anniversary like a widow arriving at a locked church to find lilies neither wilted nor wanted. I tried a childish counter-ritual. On a slip of paper, I wrote the original date of a martyrdom and set it under the heaviest dictionary I could find Latin that had defeated better men. I told myself, Mass and slept, with the self-respect of a man who had chosen the right superstition. Morning came. The date was intact. The dictionary had lost 2 entries. Both were synonyms for prompt. The chapel followed me by scent, like a dog that has chosen a new master. When a silence in the reading room became round, I knew the handless clock had put its ear to the wall. On the 4th evening I returned, not because courage had grown. Courage is a flower with a very short season, but because fear had learned the appointment book and was waiting in places I preferred to keep for prayer. The corridor felt shorter, which is to say I had accepted its price. The basalt disc was not black when I arrived. It was simply disinterested in the lamp. The flat file that once held maps now held dossiers, thin, neat, labeled in an impeccable legal hand. Index Oblivionis, the forgetting index. Inside, a ladder of verbs: rename, relocate, redate, reillustrate, reattribute, retranslate, relicense, reprint, reeducate, rebury. Each rung carried an example. A reliquary moved one parish over, and the miracle retreated from history into lullaby. a correction published under a safer name, so praise could land without consequences. A saint's day shifted a week. The protest scheduled for its anniversary arrived to an empty square and a fountain wondering what the shouting wanted. At the bottom, a line in red, as calm as a verdict: "When doubt persists, change the birthday of the doubt." I understood then what the waking books were teaching. The present is not the sum of what happened. It is the schedule of what arrives. If you want to keep a people in your pocket, you don't seize their memories. You manage their timings. Let outrage arrive after supper, after the dishes, after exhaustion has learned to yawn away the teeth of anger. Let curiosity arrive on a Friday, when offices are doors without handles. Let questions arrive during solemnities, when answers wear vestments and kneel only to themselves. My hand found the Black Sunday. It was warm, not stove warm, but stored warm, the temper of stone that chews sunlight for a living. The 12 thorns around it were not spikes, after all. They were hour marks bent inward, a crown that had forgotten every head but time. Above me, the handless clock hummed again like a hive remembering winter. I prayed without words. The prayer meant, "I see you." The chapel responded by turning a page by itself. A sound walked toward me in the dark, paper saying the name of its century. I read one line, and will give you only its spine. If memory rises like smoke, turn the hourglass. The temptation to test this was a draft, whistling under a door. I did not turn anything. I stood until the hum slackened, and the second shadow on the page lay down like a dog deciding to trust the hand that will not feed it tonight. Back in the archive, obedience tried on my shoulders like a coat from last winter, familiar, too warm, sleeves a little short. I returned the dossiers. I catalogued a psalter that smelled like moss and coins. I nodded to a scholar counting the miracles of a plague. He left with a different number than the one he brought. I did not look for Marta. She found me anyway, not with her face, but with a note in a book I was not supposed to read. She had written once in the sealed volume, "Not every correction is a cure." Here, she added in a smaller hand, "Not every cure leaves the patient alive." The sentence knew where I would be when it arrived. This is what the waking books do. They are not supernatural. They are punctual. They arrive exactly when you have become the person to whom they can speak. I tried to put the week into a ledger the church would recognize. Dates, call numbers, marginal hands, pH of inks, the careful tedium we use to convince ourselves we are guarding rather than gardening. The ledger refused me. Not with drama, no ink bled, no page tore. It simply rearranged the order of my entries so that what I had learned last presented itself first, and what I had learned first arrived as an afterthought, embarrassed to be late to its own revelation. A lesson, written in the quietest font. Sequence is doctrine. That night, the chapel's smell, iron, beeswax, the copper patience of old blood followed me to my cell. My lamp sputtered and steadied. The city exhaled itself down to the river. I lay awake, measuring the distance between heartbeat and bell. When sleep came, it brought a dream so administrative it felt like a threat. A calendar lay open on a desk that was also an altar, that was also a map. Days were pegs, months were strings. Hands I could not see moved the strings with a liturgist's economy. Events shifted obediently, then gratefully, then without noticing they had ever been elsewhere. When I woke, I knew two things. First, that I had learned enough to be useful to the wrong people. Second, that usefulness is a kind of leash. Morning filed its paperwork. I did mine. At intake, I received a bundle of chained sermons, the same set Marta had annotated. Between pages, a thin card fell to the floor. Blind embossed with the black sun, it bore a single sentence: "Silence is not sacred, it is scheduled." I slid the card back where it had been, as one returns a bone to its proper place in the reliquary. If you require a documentarian's anchor, an image to carry forward, take this and keep it clean. 2 shadows on a line of text. A rubric in red, asking a choir to sing backward until grief loses the habit of finding itself. A ladder of verbs, ending in rebury, and above it all, a clock without hands humming like a quiet engine, teaching a man in a collar that the most efficient way to erase a thing is not to burn it, but to delay its arrival until those who needed it have gone home. I wish I could end this chapter with triumph, with a proof folded into your palm like contraband bread. Instead, I can offer you the shape of a method. Listen for announcements that come late. Watch feast days that move for pastoral reasons, and notice which memories stop traveling with them. Keep your own calendar, where no gardener can trim it. Because the books are waking, and once a book wakes, it learns patiently, unfussily how to wake you. Room tone, steady, like a train heard through walls. A page turns somewhere you cannot see. A clock with no hands hums to itself. The first time I saw a century hesitate, it happened in a footnote. It was small, just a bracketed date at the bottom of a sermon about obedience. The year arrived, then re-arrived, like a guest who steps into the doorway and remembers an errand on the threshold. I checked the edition, checked the scribe's hand, checked my hunger and my pride. The number had not changed. Its obedience had. It no longer settled into the sentence the way numbers do when they know they belong. It stood apart like a polite heretic, waiting to be burned or forgiven. That was when I began to keep another index, a ledger not of anomalies, but of hesitations, moments when the century itself seemed to breathe in before answering. I called it, to myself, the night of the long noon. Not because the night was long, but because noon was. Noon stretched, noon held, noon refused to pass like a cork in the neck of an hourglass. I did not invent this phrase. I found it, in small Gothic letters, in the Black Sun office, a rubric burned into the margin, as if the scribe wanted the page to remember pain. When the faithful grow restless, let a noon be lengthened. Where a century insists on arriving whole, split it into echo and shadow. He's speeding with a live late. You know the arguments skeptics make when they are bored, that kings were invented, lists improved, calendars clumsily miscounted by sleepy clerks. I had heard the German phrase, phantomzeit, muttered by a scholar who liked the taste of scandal but not its nutrition. The chapel's doctrine was colder. It didn't say, forge a century. It said, calibrate one. There is a difference. A forgery is a lie you must keep feeding like a delicate animal. A calibration is a wheel you adjust and then forget because everything starts running smoother, and who argues with smooth? In the Index Oblivionis, there were pages stamped with a narrow, ruthless grace. On one, a column of dates carried small, red corrections, the way a healed wound carries a faint itch where weather changes. 325, moved by one feast. 1054 echoed, the note said, not split. As if the Great Schism had not been an event, but a long hallway that people mistook for a wall. 1582, the calendar, softened, not corrected, as though time were a bread you knead until it forgives your hands. I sat with that page like a novice sits with a psalm until the syllables begin to trap light. This was not villainy. This was horticulture. They weren't erasing, they were pruning. They weren't burning. They were moving the plant to better shade and calling it mercy. Marta found me there, not with footsteps, but with perfume glue and paper and the smallest of oranges, the ones with thin skins that surrender to a thumbnail. She did not touch the file. She stood with her hands behind her back, as if her own body were a reliquary that must not betray its hinge. "The night of the long noon," I said. Her mouth didn't move, and something behind her eyes did. "Be careful which words you say in this room," she answered. "Some phrases behave like open windows." "Open to what?" "To schedules," she said, and I hated that I understood. We stood like that, polite enemies of the same weather, and watched the red ink dry so slowly I had to remind my hands not to clap. The next experiment was mine. In the secret archives, Archivum Secretum, there is a chain of chronologies that like to believe themselves neutral. I took one down and laid it beside a set of letter books, the way a surgeon lays clean steel next to the body he must convince not to bleed. I looked for places where the ledger said after and the letters said meanwhile, where the ledger said immediately and the letters said when the thaw was complete, small frictions, little pebbles in the shoe of time. What I discovered first was a season that wouldn't coordinate. The letters insisted on a winter longer than the calendar allowed, processions delayed by mud that should have been dust, anniversaries arriving to bare branches when flowers were promised. I followed this seam through 3 pontificates. It held. A noon had been lengthened. No dramatics, no invented kings, just feasts moved pastorally to accommodate weather, and weather that obediently learned to arrive on days that made doctrine easier to sing. I needed God help me corroboration, not proof. The chapel does not deal in proof. It deals in cooperation in the willingness of the world to lean when leaned upon. So, I took to the maps. The flat file gave itself up like a well-trained accomplice. In the portfolio labeled Orbis Ecclesiae, the Mediterranean looked as it always does when Rome is arranging the frame, a pastoral lake with sharp memories along the shore. But the route lines had been rewritten, pilgrim roads curved to avoid anniversaries that would be inconvenient to meet at speed. A town famous for the wrong miracle had been redrawn a hair to the east, not enough to fool a sailor, just enough to make its saint's day fall under a friendlier wind. Tucked into a sleeve, a memo in a hand I had grown to respect and fear Marta's read. Calendar and cartography share a mother. We nurse them from different breasts, so no one notices the family resemblance. Then my lubs frains with positist. I closed my eyes and finally understood what had been embarrassing me at the root. The sense that the map isn't a picture of the world, it's a policy about it. There were saints who shouldn't have had feast days and did. Saints who had them and then didn't. Saints mentioned in letters with the same casual gratitude you use for bridges and then, in a later hand, crossed out with a single, slender stroke that looked like a clock hand laid upon a face. In one dossier, a list titled Canonizzati qui non sunt, canonized who are not, gave short instructions. Move the body, move the story, move the feast. Let the faithful keep the name, but teach the records to blush. If this sickens you, let me say, good. If it thrills you, let me say, keep listening. You'll need both senses working. The phantom time, as people outside the chapel tell it, is a crude theater trick. Lights dimmed, distractions multiplied, a king stitched into a missing century like a patch onto a robe. What I saw was the opposite. The lights were stabilized, the distractions were scheduled. Where the world ran ragged, the liturgy smoothed, and then claimed the smoothing as evidence that things had always been this way. If you lengthen noon, people will say the shadows look wrong, so you move the procession. You rename the bell. You teach the choir to breathe differently. By the third repetition, the shadow stops being wrong and starts being custom. In the chapel, the handless clock watched without eyes. The numerals, I threw 12, sat in their concavity, like witnesses called to testify, and sworn to say only what the room wants. Is there a moment, I asked the air, when calibration becomes a creation? The air did not answer. The book did. A page turned. The rubric at the top read, De Phantomo on the Phantom. A phantom is a consequence with a missing event. Supply the liturgy. The event will arrive later, grateful to have an altar. And is 3? I don't know if you understand this as I do, so let me wound it into clarity. If you teach people to perform the anniversary of a thing that never happened, the memory of the thing will eventually come to the feast, searching for its parent. The feast is the address. The memory is the mail. They didn't add centuries. They installed mailboxes. I began to see phantoms everywhere, not ghosts, but shadows from objects that hadn't yet been carried into the light. A papal bull, arguing elegantly with a mistake no one had confessed. A council correcting a doctrine that had never been taught aloud. A hymnal reassigning a melody to a text so specific you could reverse engineer the scandal it wanted to tame. I took notes until notes were all I had. I carried them folded under my cassock like contraband ribs. I prayed not for deliverance, but for sequence. Sequence is doctrine. I told you that at the end of the last hour, and I'm telling you again, because repetition turns an observation into a policy. If you can get people to remember things in the order that pleases you, you can keep them safe or keep them small for a very long time. I tested the sequence in small, cowardly ways. In the refectory, I told a true story, out of order, and watched a room of men who take vows for a living agree to a false lesson because it felt neater. In the scriptorium, I placed 2 editions of the same chronicle side by side and rearranged the piles of paper so the older one always lay closer to the door. By evening, 3 scholars swore the older reading had been cited more often that day. The ledger, which counts nothing but counts everything, disagreed. It wasn't the paper that persuaded them. It was the corridor, the path things took, from hand to hand. We curate routes the way we curate relics. We kiss what is closest. Marta cornered me 2 nights later on a stair that spirals tighter the longer you believe in it. She had a roll of maps under one arm, and the kind of tired I recognized from funerals where the family prefers etiquette to grief. You're looking for fireworks, she said. You want a mechanism you can switch off with a brave prayer. I want a lever I can name, I said. Then I'll decide whether to pull it. There isn't one, she said. There is only practice. You do a thing under a rubric long enough, and it becomes a room. And once it's a room, people will live there and say the weather outside is sinful. What about your notes? I asked. You measured unrest. You called delay a mercy. She winced at her own handwriting hanging in the air. I was younger then. Are you older now? In need no ways, take in verse. And no three, I'm later, she said. And then she did something I didn't deserve. She told me a secret that could not be quoted in a court, but could be lived into the ground like a stake. Some feasts are decoys, she said. They are there to move pilgrims away from anniversaries we don't want them to meet. Decoys, I repeated, and the word felt like wax that will remember a seal. How many? As many as there are dangerous truths. Enough to tire an honest man, she said, fewer than an ambitious one would like. She left me with the maps and a stare that finally admitted it arrived someplace. When she was gone, I took the maps to the chapel. I put them on the basalt disc and watched how the light refused them. The black sun took nothing. It only taught the lamp to mind its manners. On the desk, the De Fantomo rubric waited with the patience of an animal that knows you will eventually return to feed it. I fed it. I read aloud. The words did not feel forbidden in my mouth. They felt efficient. Where a century refuses to imitate doctrine, make a noon. Keep the bell ringing so slowly, the echo cannot find its parent. If an event arrives uninvited, let it sit in a pew behind its own anniversary until it learns to be quiet. The clock hummed approval. Dust lifted and fell in a slow applause. I turned the page and found a diagram concentric circles like the rings left by a cup on a lectern. At the center, the word anniversary. Around it, 3 bands labeled liturgy, route, law. In the margin, a note in a different hand. The stern, precise hand I now knew as the chapel's read. Move any ring, and the others will adjust. The center remains where people agree to meet. Do you see it yet? You do not need to add years if you control where people agree to meet their memory. You can make a phantom by telling the memory to report to a different door. If it arrives at the wrong door often enough, the door becomes the right one, and the old door is simply forgotten. I tested this on myself. I chose a date I loved, a benign one. The day my mother taught me to read from a missal too heavy for my lap. I wrote it on a card and placed it inside a book I use for consolation, a psalter whose spine knows my grief by name. A week later, I moved the card to a book I read out of duty. Another week, to a book I take down when I wish to feel proud of knowing how to take books down. 3 months later, I could not remember which day my mother had given me her finger to follow under the red letters. I remembered the rooms. I remembered the roots. The date itself had become a noon that refused to pass. This is the part of the documentary where the narrator tells you what the authorities say. Here is what they say, in voices trained by old stone. We do not create. We correct. We do not erase. We curate. We do not delay. We discern the season. I am not here to argue. I am here to say that a season can be lengthened until it becomes a century with its hands folded. When morning broke over Rome like a coin someone had polished overnight, I brought the dossiers back to the archive and did the only brave thing left to a coward. I filed them correctly. Then I went to my cell and counted the number of breaths it took for a bell to cross the square and arrive at my window. If you need a number, It was 12. Not because I am sentimental, but because the chapel has a sense of humor. You want a conclusion for this hour, and all I can offer is a method you can hold up to the light and watch your own calendar flinch. Listen for anniversaries that show up late and call it pastoral care. Watch for processions that arrive at the wrong square and are applauded for their obedience. Notice when an argument is answered by a feast rather than a fact, and when a century hesitates in a footnote. Don't be civilized. Ask it who taught it to pause. Because if the night of the long noon is real, and I believe it is not a hoax but a habit, then the way out is not louder bells. It is refusing to meet your own memory at the door they chose. I will take you deeper next into the cartographers of memory, those patient gardeners who trim maps until truth learns to prefer a different climate. But before we go, keep one image in your pocket like a medal you don't wear in public. A clock without hands approving a schedule it did not need to invent. A page that turns itself because it knows you have arrived. And a noon that lengthens just enough for a century to catch its breath and learn a new order of procession. Maps, they taught us, are humble. A servant's art, ink plus direction, plus the courtesy to admit where the sea begins to forget names. But I learned in the chapel that humility can be camouflage. A map is not a picture. A map is a permission, a door policy for the world. I did not want this knowledge. I wanted a miracle I could refuse. Instead, I found drawers. The flat file yielded to my fingers with the weakness of a saint who has decided to confess. The first portfolio wore a vellum tab impressed with a stamp I had come to dread, a dim circle ringed by 12 thorns, half-veiled, like an eclipse that refused to choose between honesty and technique. Inside, Orbis Ecclesiae, the Church's world. The Mediterranean stared up like an iris. The Holy Land, a contracted pupil. The coasts were drafted with patient wrists, an obedience to bays and promontories that a sailor would respect. But the routes, the pilgrim lines, the trade arteries, the sanctioned wanderings of souls were wrong in a way that only felt right if you had first learned to sing the hours backward. It is a small thing to bend a road on paper. It is a large thing to make the road the only one people are told is safe. I traced a path from Compostela eastward and watched it swerve away from an anniversary that would have drawn too many feet to a square that still remembered a martyr's original day. Another road, south, toward a port whose name had once belonged to a heresy, curved delicately 2 miles inland to a chapel, famous for mercy, and what luck equidistant from 3 feasts that could absorb any protest by outsinging it. Tucked into the fold, a memo in Marta's hand. If the route is allowed, the memory travels with it. If the route is refused, the memory must learn a different gait. I pressed my thumb to the ink. It was long, dry, centuries dry, but it felt fresh in the way a decision does when it is repeated. I turned the page. Another map, almost identical, except a river had moved a little. Not enough to wet new fields, enough to let a procession cross on a bridge that would deliver the faithful after Vespers, when outrage has learned to bow. In the corner, a hairline notation in red, "Marta, keep the bridge. The bell will handle the rest." I put the sheet down, as if it could bruise. I am tempted, here, to give you a lecture about projections, how Mercator fattens the north so empires look important, how equal area maps unlatch pride and let continents breathe. I won't. The chapel's cartographers practice a humbler sorcery. They do not make the world larger or smaller. They make it later, a new drawer. The label read, Itineraria Sanctorum, the Travel Guides of Saints. Pages of neat columns describing where to eat, where to sleep, where to kiss the relic through grating. Each itinerary, a braided story. Miracle, mile, miracle, mile. On the margin of one, a stamped emblem of a winged shoe, an indulgent joke. On another, a series of crosses next to towns whose names had been softened over time. Violentia to Valentia, Disputa to Dispensa, letters rearranged until the mouth learned peace instead of precision. A slip fell out, thin as a breath. I caught it. Blind embossed with the Black Sunday a sentence in Latin. Non mutamus locum, mutamus adventum. We do not change the place, we change the arrival. I felt the handless clock above me, then the way you feel weather move from bone to skin. I looked up, expecting nothing, preparing for everything. The numerals IX2I were steady, concave as ever, but the air around the dial was busier. A moth frailty of dust tracing gentle spirals as if the chapel were exhaling maps. I shut the drawer and opened another. Index Nominium. The name's index. Columns like abbey cloisters, cool in their order. Rivers renamed for virtues when their old names ran toward arguments. A coastline retitled after apostles, so sailors would swear by Peter and John before they swore by local wind. Forests rededicated to angels when the trees learned to say too much about a battle never officially fought. At the bottom of the sheet, a small admonition in black. Rename no mountain unless the mountain has agreed to keep a secret. I smiled, then I stopped. Humor is a gate too. It admits what would look like arrogance if the joke were not well told. Footsteps on stone. The corridor presented me with a sound and then removed it before I could catalog it. The chapel has a way of testing your appetite. Hunger, fear, and curiosity are served in the same bowl. I set the name's index aside and reached for a thicker packet. Portolani sailors' maps lashed together with a silk cord, fastened by a knot that had learned obedience centuries ago and was proud of it. I undid the knot. The cords remembered and fell into the shape of obedience without being told. Winds filled the vellum roses of wind, lines and petals intersecting at ports, little notes near each petal, monks' tidy hands telling captains which months were civilized and which months should be given to God. Another memo from Marta, teach the harbor to celebrate on a day the wind cannot reach it. I felt tired in a new way, as if I had finally found how many muscles a conscience uses. Are you cataloging? A voice behind me asked. Or fishing? Marta. She stood without coat now, sleeves rolled, wrists ink-dusted. She had the expression of a person who has left a room that was performing grief properly and stepped into a hallway that prefers candor. She did not move closer. The chapel punishes distance and rewards it, alternately, like a tutor who believes in rigor. Roots, I said. Roots, she agreed, and leaned her head against the invisible wall between us. You were right about the Black Sun office. It doesn't invent, it aligns. Aligns what with what? She smiled, tired and exact. Bells with feet. We let the sentence stand until it learned to sit. Tell me about decoy feasts, I said. You hinted before. That is res in the rations. The never one, in like absence, all was really recome. She looked at my hands, not my face. Decoys exist to keep a crowd safe from an anniversary, or to keep an anniversary safe from a crowd. Which is mercy? Ask the map, she said. Mercy is topography plus bell schedule. She reached past me, carefully, and slid out a shallow tray from the bottom of the cabinet. If you must see the knife, here. The tray held small brass stencils, a lattice of standard pilgrim symbols, scallop shell, cross, chalice, wheel, each paired with a tiny arrow, the kind of tool a scribe would lay on a map to normalize symbols across editions. In the corner, an etching plate with roads and a flourish, as if a signature had learned to be a street. Stencils, I said, because naming things is supposed to steal their power. Gatekeepers, she corrected. A town becomes a destination when the symbol repeats often enough. The faithful read with their feet. We give them an alphabet. And when a destination is dangerous, she lifted the etching plate, stared through the lace of lines. We respell it. There was no scorn in her voice, only a craftsman's clinical regret. I felt anger flare, the clean, dumb kind that loves itself for how hot it is. People pray with maps, I said. People pray, she answered. If a map is what allows them to arrive together rather than alone, I don't know whether to call that control or care. Both, I said. Both, she agreed, and slid the tray back. Which is why we would rather you stayed out of this room. She left without turning her back, as if the chapel might charge. I was alone again with the ports, the roads, the quiet mouth of the handless clock. A new portfolio, thick enough that my arms remembered it. Tabulae hereticarum, tables of heresies. I expected lists, arrows, a taxonomy of errors. I found maps. Trails not of doctrine but of travel where unsanctioned ideas had moved physically, along rivers with patient names, across mountain passes famous for mules and not for monks. Next to each route, a notation of counter-route, the official itinerary of preaching and pardons scheduled to arrive late by just enough to catch the echo, not the voice. They never chased the event. They learned the route and tuned the arrival. I turned a page and felt the room lean. In the bottom corner of the map, a small church icon, almost an afterthought, bore a name I knew from my childhood, Sancta Lucia Minor, a chapel that stood, I had been told, where my grandmother's village met the river. I had knelt there once, tiny, while my mother traced the blaze of a saint's eyes in stained glass and told me to beware of the dark that pretends to offer rest. The map showed the chapel 2 valleys over, a red note, precise and unemotional. Move Lucia to shadow the fire at Castel Bruni. Keep the feast, change the bridge. I breathed, then failed to. This is the part where you want me to flip the table, to cry out in Latin so the room respects me. I steadied my hands. I am a priest. We are trained to hide tempests in chalices. I copied the notation into my pocketbook with the slow rage of a man who knows he cannot afford to be theatrical. Then I did what all decent men do when their past is redrafted. I went to the library, not the secret archives. The library of sanctioned memory, the quiet nave of catalogs where light behaves itself and dust knows its place. I pulled atlases, parish registers, and a thin volume printed in a provincial press that had once been accused of accuracy. The village lists agreed with the chapel's map, not my grandmother's tongue. Lucia had always been 2 valleys over. The stained glass I remembered belonged to Sanctus Marcus now, and his eyes did not blaze. They had learned to be pastoral. My memory about Lucia had become a minor heresy, correctable by a kind librarian with a smile that smelled of glue. I closed the book and saw, In the curve of the page, the Black Sunday, I returned to the chapel. If you are keeping a ledger of my courage, mark none for that day. I went back because the room had trained my feet to prefer it. The corridor narrowed like a psalm that has lost some words. The chapel opened like a mouth that remembers a name. On the lectern, a new rubric. Devie on ways. A way is a liturgy, where feet supply the chorus. To govern a way, add stanzas of shelter, subtract stanzas of thirst. If an anniversary keeps tripping the faithful, pave the trouble with a market. The next lines were practical. Instructions for how to draw a change so that a future copyist, working from the map, would believe the world and not the drawing was to blame. Alter the grade steeper, the marsh wider, the ford deeper. Do not move the Sunday. Move the shade. A diagram, 3 lines, nearly identical. Under the first, heresy. Under the second, heresy. Under the third, heresy again. Tired now. I laughed. My laugh stayed in my throat like a moth. On the floor, the basalt disc decided to be warm. I put my palm to it and felt, like before, that quality of stored heat stone that chews the day and offers the night polite portions. You see the knife now, someone said. Not Marta. One of the men from the colonnade, the taller, the one who liked the world when it behaved like an archive. He stood at the threshold where corridors learn humility. He did not enter. The chapel imposes a tax on people who belong to other rooms. We keep what can be walked, he said. The sentence reissued like a coin with new relief. And what cannot be walked? I asked. He considered me the way a man considers a dog and decides whether the animal belongs to him or to itself. We let it arrive late, he said. Late arrivals do not cause panic. Panic is noise. Noise is amateur. Professionalism, I said. As a theology, he smiled without pleasure. You want a villain, he said. We are gardeners. He left, which is to say the chapel returned him to a hallway that needed him more. I stayed. The next portfolio was the kind of deception only an honest man could love. Errata et corrigenda, lists of corrections published in neat pamphlets and tucked into the back of atlases, like apologies written in a small hand. Corrections to spellings, to distances, to the number of days a journey requires in seasons that have learned to respect newer bells. Each correction a step that leans you 1 pace away from the square where history had been waiting to meet you. On one sheet, a long correction to a description of a pass through the Apennines. The old text said the pass was free in early spring. The new, that late spring was safer. A red addendum, almost flirtatious. The rain will agree. I imagined the rain given its script for the season like a canticle. I imagined weather behaving because a rubric had promised it would. Then I imagined 3 carts laden with books, not contraband, not sacred, simply urgent, arriving after the pass closed by exactly the number of days needed to keep a council from reading them in time. The handless clock hummed, not to agree or disagree, but to measure how long my throat stayed dry. If you have been with me this far, you deserve a novelty. The chapel, generous in its cruelty, offered me a glossary terms its cartographers use when their hands outpace their prayers. Softening, moving an anniversary by a friendly feast, so the anger learns to yawn. De-singing, changing a route so the choir reaches the square after sunset. Mercatoring, expanding a jurisdiction's importance without moving a border. Lucia, ing, translating a beloved local story 2 valleys over. Black noon. When the bell insists its time is the skies. I copied the glossary and felt a guilty elation, a craftsman's thrill at knowing the names of the knives. Language is a liturgy too. If you can name a motion, you can repeat it without thinking. I did not notice the new drawer open until it had already decided I should see it. Tabularum, exorcismi tables of exorcism. I expected rites. I found floor plans, diagrams of libraries, not shelves and call numbers, but paths between them. Arrows from history to hagiography, from geography to canon law, tidy lines showing a patron's likely journey, small, almost tender notes. Move the copy of Athanasius 2 shelves higher to discourage casual hands. Place the skeptical atlas between 2 genealogies. Curiosity tires faster when family is nearby. Keep the thinner copy near the sunlight. Scholars with weak eyes choose mercy. Exorcism, then, did not cast out demons. It cast out roots. It drilled new ones until ideas learned to avoid certain corners of the mind. I shut the drawer, then opened it again because I did not trust my first refusal. The last note in that file, unsigned: silence is not the absence of speech. Silence is the predictable walk between shelves. I went to the door. I did not leave. The chapel that night felt like a city that has agreed to be a single room. I returned to the maps. Martyrologium Cartographicum Martyrs, rendered as points of light, each star labeled with a date that tasted correct until it was read aloud, at which point the room inhaled and the numbers flinched. The constellation of saints formed a shape I had seen, scratched on the wall near the catacomb mirror. A net with 1 tie cut. A note: leave the tie. Teach the pilgrim to step wide. A stumble becomes a custom in 3 generations. I thought of my grandmother's hands, flour-dusted, tracing a map in air. Here, Lucia, here, the river. Here, the bridge, and I knew, with a tiredness that respectably hid its wounds, that I had been raised on a decoy, that I had loved a route invented to spare someone else's truth, that my memory was a place the church had gardened because it wanted my anger asleep. I sat on the basalt, because standing is for men with work they can still deny. The handless clock made that tiny, obscene click. The numerals settled the way a crowd settles when a speaker they trust clears his throat. I did not pray. Prayer would have been a way to perform obedience in a room that had already taught me the choreography. I did something worse. I opened the Officium Solis Nigrantis to the page I had refused. The rubric at the top read, "Deligno on the lattice. Wherever memory has grown like vine, erect a lattice so that it climbs where it can be harvested without hazard. If the vine insists on the old wall, shade the wall. If the vine insists on the old sun, install a black noon." A marginal hand familiar, guarded, added, "A lattice may become a prison only to those who remember stone." I closed the book, and finally, let anger have a chair. "Stone remembers," I said aloud. The chapel listened. Paper answered. A page turned by itself. The next rubric, De Reversione, on turning back. "If you would undo a road, do not tear it up. Walk it in the wrong season, until your feet forget why it was made. Then teach another way, and let the old way fall asleep under grass." I understood, suddenly and with indecent clarity, what the climax would require. Not proof, not revelation to shame the gardeners into changing their knives, The only counter-ritual that ever works against practice is practice. If they had turned the hours backward to put grief to bed, I would have to turn something forward to wake time up. If they had tuned bells to feet, I would have to give feet a bell they did not control. If they had laid lattices for vines of memory, I would have to teach the vine to climb the stone again. The room hummed. The basalt under me stored warmth like a vow it would keep when I could not. The flat files held still, a city pretending to be furniture. Somewhere, the librarian's exorcisms continued, roots tidied, shelves reordered, patrons spared. Somewhere, a saint 2 valleys over kept her feast with a small, obedient joy that did not remember why it had moved. I stood. The chapel did not try to stop me. At the threshold, where the corridor prepares your bones for other weather, I looked back. The handless clock looked like a wound that had healed beautifully and forgotten the danger of beauty. The black sun did not shine. It canceled the light that presumed to organize it. Bells and feet, I said, repeating Marta. Bells and feet. The corridor offered me its narrow mercy. The city rose to meet me, its squares rehearsed, its winds literate, its maps patient. If you need an image to carry into the next hour, take this. A pilgrim road slightly bent so that a crowd arrives home, too peaceful to remember what it meant to be angry. A librarian who moves a book 1 shelf higher so a question misses its appointment by exactly the width of a trembling arm. A river whose bridge has learned the pastoral virtue of late. And a priest who has finally agreed that the only knife he can wield inside a garden is the one that cuts his own habits. I have shown you the cartographers. Now I will show you the liturgy they obey. When we return, we will light the Black Sunday, we will sing the matins of unlight, we will stand under a clock that has never owned hands and decide, together, whether to give it ours. Midwinter came like a sentence without a verb. The river glazed itself into a polite refusal. The squares rehearsed emptiness so thoroughly the pigeons forgot their lines. Rome at night is a city that knows how to look occupied while sleeping. It wears shutters the way a monk wears silence professionally. I waited for a moon that would not arrive. When the sky had convinced itself that silver was a rumor, I took the key. The service door yielded as always, grudging, then intimate. The corridor accepted my lamp and made a tunnel of the dark. I had learned by then not to count steps. Numbers behave badly in places that have learned to bend. I walked by smell instead, stone, beeswax, and that copper patience of old blood. At the seam where the air cools from ordinary to curated, I stopped. Marta had not promised she would come. She was there anyway. No coat. Sleeves rolled to the same deliberate line. Hands empty. This was new. The kind of empty that leaves a dent in the air, where tools should be. You shouldn't be here, she said. I've been here too often to be new, I said. Tonight, I intend to be different. She considered the word. Different how? Present. We looked at the door that was not a door, and then at each other, the way 2 compasses look at a magnet and admit it runs the room. We could leave, she said. We won't, I said. We didn't. The chapel received us like a confession after the penitent has learned to breathe between sentences. Candles stood around the basalt disc 12, 1 for each thorn. Their flames leaned inward, as if the center of the floor were a window, and something below had weather. The handless clock hummed with the confidence of a veteran choir. On the unchained lectern, the Officium Solis Nigrantis lay open to a rubric that made the room lower its voice. Matins of unlight. In a tidy script beneath, for nights without a moon, for calendars that have developed opinions, for centuries that refuse to cue. Vadian severades seblag lasser. I looked at Marta the way a student looks at a teacher they will love later for not stopping them. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She moved to the far side of the disc, opposite me, and took a position the way a bell takes air into its lungs. There is a preparation before any rite. You set the room on a path it cannot easily forget. We checked the wicks. We loosened the latch of the window that isn't a window. We put our hands on the basalt and listened for the stored heat that would agree to share itself. Read, Marta said. The first rubric told me where to stand and how to stand there. Take the posture of a witness, not a judge. Do not borrow the gavel of God. Do not pretend the hour has asked you for advice. I swallowed the impulse to be grand and let the room be the largest thing present. The base of the city's sleep pressed into the walls. The candles learned a common tilt. I began. Antiphon the first. On teaching the hour to forget its teeth. The Latin came like a hymn I hated and could not help singing. Each line named a year whose edges had made trouble and then gave it a cushion. Anno trecentesimo vicesimo quinto, move the feast one day. Let the anger arrive to closed doors. Anno millesimo quinquagesimo quarto, echo the schism. Halls remember better than walls. Anno millesimo quingentesimo octogesimo secundo, soften the calendar. Let the sky forgive our arithmetic. It did not feel like magic. It felt like administration with perfect pitch. At the third verse, I heard the clock change its mind about something and then commit. Dust rose. The numerals leaned a breath inward, as if a giant had exhaled behind the dial. Candles aligned themselves along a curve the basalt disc politely suggested. I stopped. Stopping was not in the rubric. Marta closed her eyes so completely it looked like an argument and an obedience at the same time. Continue, she said. I continued. Lesson the first. On the custody of anniversaries. Anniversaries are lungs. Move the rib cage. The breath will become unambitious. The text described methods I had already memorized, but hearing them in the key of night made them indecently reasonable. Shift a saint, recite a market, bend a road so that pilgrims must stop where a bell can say what the sun cannot. It was a recipe for consensus. I read as if I were tasting poison personally brewed. A candle guttered and righted itself without losing a drop of light. The handless clock clicked. The click was smaller than a decision and larger than consent. Responsory. We keep what can be walked. I wanted to skip it. The line had become a coin too often pressed into my palm. But the chapel knows when pride is an avoidance. I sang the refrain the rubric asked me to sing, and in the verses I named the cities that had been bent into a choreography. Valentia, that was Violentia. Dispensa, that was Disputa. The bridge that moved to supply obedience with a plank. The black sun seemed to absorb the syllables and hand them back as heat through the stone. This is the part where you will ask if I was afraid. I was, but fear is a ladder the mind climbs when it wishes to reach an excuse. I stayed on the floor. We reached the nocturne, the deep hour within the hour. Marta spoke for the first time in the rite. Listen. I listened. The chapel's hum changed into something like the sound a hive makes when winter convinces bees that patience is a virtue. A single page turned without being asked to. I did not look at it. I am not brave enough to rush what wants to arrive. The second rubric is the one that gives professionals a thrill. It is where work stops pretending to be prayer and becomes what it has always been. On turning the hourglass. If memory rises like smoke, turn the glass so sand falls like rain. The hourglass stood at the edge of the disk, modest and perfectly respectable, the kind of tool that believes in itself even when you drop it. Its sand was a pale, clerical gold. It had learned to behave for centuries. My hand, obedient to the rubric, reached. "Wait," Marta said. I waited. We had not agreed on dissent. We had not agreed on courage. We had only agreed to be present at the same time. She walked the circle of candles slowly, the way a person walks through a room where a child is asleep. At the sixth flame, she paused and pinched it out. The room grew more symmetrical and more dangerous. "Now," she said. I touched the glass. The hum became pulse. The numerals deepened another hair. A smear of shadow crossed the face of the clock, where no hand existed to make it. I did not turn the hourglass. I also did not withdraw. I held it, as if one could keep time in place by refusing to declare a direction. "Frater," Marta said, and in my own name I heard what the Church has always wanted to hear from its servants, an agreement that sounds like a vow and is actually a very shy betrayal. "We are gardeners," she whispered. "We are witnesses," I answered. She looked at the candles. The candles looked at me. "Then witness," she said. I put the hourglass down. The room did not punish me. That is how you know you are in the presence of a method rather than a god. I returned to the lectern. Antiphon the second, on the lattice for vines of memory. Erect a trellis where the vine can be harvested without hazard. Shade the old wall. Install a black noon. The prayer taught me how to be useful to the wrong future. Each sentence asked me to give consent to a convenience. Each convenience promised mercy to someone too tired to argue. At the close, the rubrics offered a brief instruction in de-singing how to route a procession so that a choir arrives after sunset, so that rage must learn to whisper and thus forgets its words. I swallowed around a dry place in my throat. The basalt under my palm was not hot. It was certain. The clock agreed to measure that certainty. A sound in the corridor footsteps negotiated into silence by the chapel's geometry announced the men from the colonnade before their bodies decided to be visible. The taller remained at the threshold as always. The other stepped barely inside, as if paying a toll he had argued down. "This is unnecessary," the taller said. "Unnecessary to whom?" Marta asked without turning. "To people who sleep," he said. "They rely on us to keep the morning legible." "Legible is a kind word for obedient," I said. He smiled in a way that made me feel grated. "Professionalism," he said to me softly, as if we were still sharing a private joke we had never told. "You understand." And 8-1, "I understand cultivation," I said. "I also understand pruning until the tree forgets it was a wild thing." "This is not your decision," I gestured to the book. "And yet the rubric asks for a cantor." His eyes traveled to the handless clock. "The clock prefers people who know how to continue." "Then it will be disappointed," I said, and returned to the text. Lesson the second. De phantomo. A phantom is a consequence with a missing event. Supply the liturgy. The event will arrive later. Grateful to have an altar. I read it aloud to the men, so there would be no dispute later about what I had been told. Mailboxes, I said after the verse, translating the doctrine into a word a street could understand. You've installed mailboxes for memories that never lived here. They did not deny it. Gardening, the taller repeated, as if my objection were a kind of weather he had learned to walk through. Marta lit the sixth candle again without looking at her fingers. The room filled with the idea of noon. The night of the long noon had found its instrument. I reached the part of the office that had tempted me for weeks. A narrow column of text labeled Clavis the Key. It offered 3 gestures and a promise. Turn the hourglass. The century will sleep. Lift the hourglass. The century will wait. Break the hourglass. The century will wake and refuse you, now or later. It is its own mercy to choose. I stood like a man with multiple gravities. Marta watched me and did not breathe for the space of a verse. The taller man spoke across the distance, like a priest at a baptism he would rather not perform. You are not the first custodian to stand there, he said. We rely on their discipline. You rely on their sequence, I said. And on yours, he said. The hourglass was light. It had to be. Gravity is the only honest priest. I lifted it. The sand fell faster. I could feel time adjusting its coat. I could feel a century listening for its name from behind a door we had chosen for it. Frate, Marta said, so quietly I almost rebuked the air for inventing her voice. If you break it, we can't pretend not to have heard. If I don't, I said, we can't pretend we didn't agree. Silence is not sacred. Silence is scheduled. I did not raise the hourglass higher. I did not set it down. I turned it a quarter turn and found the angle where sand hesitated on the cusp between obedience and grievance. The room thickened. The handless clock made its almost inaudible tick, and then remembered it had never owned hands, and therefore could not be accused of ticking. The taller man took one step in. The chapel taxed him for it. He swallowed the proof. Choose, he said. I did. I broke the hourglass. It was not dramatic. Glass is a servant. It did what it was told. A soft knock against the lip of the basalt, and it surrendered, the way a fact surrenders when it has stored too many polite lies in its back. Sand spilled in a half-moon, and then completed the circle, learning the disk and agreeing to be its shore. The candles leaned farther toward the center, as if instructed by weather. The numerals sank a fraction deeper, then rose as if correcting themselves or forgiving us for our method. The hum that had been a hive became the sound a city makes when its bells ring honestly for exactly one breath. The taller man closed his eyes, and the other made the sign of the cross in a direction no map respects. Marta did not move. The room exhaled. Somewhere far above us, a bell rang the hour it had been denying. I heard footsteps in the library changing their minds about which shelf to trust. I felt the roots between maps adjust by the width of a finger. I did not see centuries rearrange. That is not how centuries confess. But I felt a habit loosen some practiced agreement between schedule and memory, relax its shoulders and admit it had been working overtime. The rubric did not account for the sound of broken glass. It supplied a psalm instead, psalm of reversal. We sang it without deciding to sing it. 2 voices, and something that joined us from the stone. A third that had always been sterile and had finally agreed to be a little human. The words were simple and unliturgical, as if a child had written them before anyone taught the child what doctrine asks of diction. Let what was moved remember its first address. Let what was softened remember its edge. Let what was scheduled learn to arrive because it is time, not because the bell permitted it. The candles steadied. The disk grew cool the way bread cools when a hungry table has finally been served. I looked at the broken glass and thought of every decoy feast, every bridge that had learned a pastoral sense of late, every village renamed until grandmothers' tongues were embarrassed to remember their own maps. I am sorry, I said to the room that had given me a method so beautiful I had almost consented to be its instrument. You are late, the room answered, and late tonight was a mercy for once. The men from the colonnade withdrew without remarks. They will write some later, professionals, tidy, even their shock. Marta remained. She knelt not in adoration, but in fatigue, and gathered the larger pieces of glass into her hands, as if they were a corpse we both had known and not loved. We will pay for this, she said. Yes, I said. With sequence, yes. She looked up at the clock and then back at me. There will be errata, she said, a librarian's future tense. Let them be honest ones, I said. Let them admit to the shelf they used to live on. She smiled and did not apologize for it. You pray like a man who has learned a second language late. I am late, I said, to everything that matters. We stood. We blew out the candles. All but one. Leave one, the rubric had said. For the event that will arrive without our help, we left one. The corridor had the temperature of hard decisions. I felt the city preparing to argue with its morning, and then deciding to let the argument grow old. The river negotiated with itself in the quiet grammar of winter. I did not ask Marta to walk with me. She did anyway. We did not plan where to go. We went to the library because a priest is a homing bird, and the shelves were our weather. In the reading room, a scholar lifted his head at a bell he had learned not to notice, and blinked as if a number had just remembered to be suspicious. A map was found to be a half-inch wider than its frame allowed. A procession timetable in a parish register had acquired two versions of the same day, each plausible, neither triumphant. We passed between history and hagiography, and I only felt, don't make me certify it, that the shortcut favored by patrons had shifted a foot to the left. Not closed, not forbidden, different. Bells and feet, I said. Bells and feet, Marta answered, and for once it sounded like hope and not like inventory. If you require an image to hang the hour on, take this one and keep it where your wrist can find it later, a circle of spilled sand on a stone that stores the Sunday. A clock without hands, remembering that hands were always a metaphor. A lamp that no longer needs to lean because the room has learned a new center of gravity. And two people who are not heroes, becoming present in the only way that matters, not with proof, not with purity, but with the refusal to let a century fall asleep just because the lullaby is excellent. I will give you one last confession before we climb the longest stair. When I crushed the hourglass, I thought the room would punish me with spectacle thunder, a choir of disapproval, a statute waking to change my name to ash. Instead, it gave me something I had not been disciplined to recognize as grace, time that arrived on its own. This is more frightening than any devil, because if time can arrive without being scheduled, then questions can arrive without an invitation. And if questions can arrive, The most dangerous thing to them is already happening. Memory is waking up. We left the chapel because staying would have turned what we had done into theater, and theater is how the gardeners reclaim their tools. The corridor returned our breath to ordinary temperature. The stone gave back its honest chill. Somewhere a broom resumed being a broom. Yet the angles of the building had shifted by imperceptible degrees, like chairs after a long meeting when people push them in without looking. The difference lived in wrists and ankles. Hinges knew. The hand knows before doctrine admits it. We did not sleep. Between stacks that understand patience, we counted the little refusals that kept arriving. A card catalog that conceded the former shelf as a parenthesis rather than an erasure. A parish register that allowed two versions of the same day to stand shoulder to shoulder without insisting on a duel. A procession map that tried to keep its route and, failing, wrote a footnote, asking to be remembered where it used to turn. None of it belonged in a courtroom. All of it belonged in a kitchen drawer where useful things rest until they are needed quickly. There are drawers for justice too, we discovered, and they are rarely labeled in a way tourists appreciate. When the hour turned, with the cautious grace of frost lifting from a step, we walked the long way because straight lines felt like signatures on contracts we had not read. A grocer adjusted the tilt of an awning and, by accident or intuition, allowed more sky into the street than yesterday. The river rehearsed a line it had said for centuries, and then changed the cadence at the last word, which is how you announce that something small has changed without giving anyone permission to panic. "Will they print something?" I asked. "They will print a kindness and schedule it for a time when it causes the least reassembly," she said. "And I will keep breathing things where hands can reach them, and refuse to apologize for their pulse." We did not discuss courage. Courage had been misshelved under theater for too long. I know what an audience desires in the last act. A mask peeled from a villain whose real face is uglier than the mask. A ledger, a gavel, a cue of penitence suddenly crash-landing into contrition. You must forgive the absence. This story is made of methods and minutes. Methods do not confess. Minutes do not repent. They accrete until the room must adapt or admit it was pretending to be a room. So I will make it larger through attention. I will add rooms and windows until scale does the work thunder could not. I will lay down roots, and you will walk them with me, slowly, because slowness is the only currency they cannot tax. First, the year that refuses permission. In January, you copy the page that moved and pin it somewhere: vulgar elevator, bus shelter, bakery line beside a handwritten note naming the shelf it used to live on. In February, you stand 1 hour early on a bridge that learned to be late and jot the names of people who arrive without choreography. You offer no explanation. When they ask why you are there, you simply say, "I like the view before the view begins." In March, you teach a child 2 names for the same square and walk both names until the child decides with their shoes. You say nothing when they choose the longer way home. In April, you host a quiet minute on a stoop and invite neighbors to bring one instance of a bell disagreeing with sky. They write the time on scraps, and you collect them in a shoebox called weather. You do not curate the box. You only keep it where it can be borrowed. In May, you plant a vine on a wall instead of a trellis, and document which structure compromises first. The pictures go in the shoebox. In June, you place a banned paragraph beside a permitted one on a photocopier. Make twins, switch their positions for an afternoon, return them in evening light. You record who noticed with kindness. In July, you draw the city from memory on paper, too small for correctness, and circle where the route hurts. If you don't know, you walk until you do. In August, you visit the oldest clerk who still remembers when hard afternoon light on ledgers taught people to finish early. You bring peaches. You ask for the story that embarrassed an office. You promise to keep the names as initials until the names are dead. In September, you sing the quietest hymn you know, one stanza early in a church where no one is listening, and observe what softens in your own voice. In October, you audit a festival. What comes first? What arrives late? Which truths were scheduled for the hour when feet are tired? You publish your margins by taping them at knee height, so children read them first. In November, you write letters to yourself listing 3 names that blush streets, saints, rivers, and you postdate the envelopes 10 years. You trust the slow mail of your own house. In December, you keep vigil at midnight without bells and let the sky bless the hour directly. You log the discrepancy in a notebook with a cracked spine, and you never give this notebook to anyone who asks for it too confidently. Between these labors, there will be scenes that insist on being memorized. A widow in a square brings figs and bread to the old day, and 4 others join without agreement. They do not call it resistance, they call it lunch. A child chalks a route the rain erased, and the choir, late by custom, follows laughing to the wrong corner, which is only wrong because a committee declared it so. The hymn arrives to an alley where laundry approvingly sways, a proof no court requires. A librarian raises a book 1 shelf higher as instructed and places a stool beneath it without reporting the stool. This is the quietest kind of courage and the most contagious. A portolan bears a coffee ring right where wind instructions once summoned obedience. A later hand writes wind arrived early, harbor learned. Any sailor reading it knows exactly how to proceed, and none of them ask for a meeting. The gardeners will be industrious. Expect forums where delay is renamed dialogue, where the choreography of listening rehearses itself beneath panel lighting, so kindly diffused you could nap and call it participation. Expect maps with friendlier colors and signage so generous you forget to look for the corner that used to be a shortcut and is now a scenic detour. Expect your phone to loan its small tyrannies to bells until noon becomes a notification. Expect your guild of witnesses to fracture over vocabulary. One person's pruning is another person's wound. One person's trellis is another person's cage. Keep the verbs. Let the nouns differ. Notice, name, walk, keep, arrive. The house can survive a quarrel about curtains if the foundation is agreed. Because the gardeners are competent, they will also attempt hospitality. Competence loves to host. They will ask you to moderate a conversation that turns practice into performance. Remember the room in which you broke the hourglass. It did not punish you with spectacle. It gave you space. Decline the stage. Bring a ledger. Read your minutes from the square they forgot. Forget to smile. The most subversive thing in a well-lit room is a refusal to be decorative. There will be temptations peculiar to the late. The first is eloquence. Do not let your sentences do all the walking. Eloquence is a solvent. It dissolves consequence into aesthetic. Guard against beauty that leaves no fingerprints. The second is loneliness. The square will be empty sometimes. Make tea. Write the weather. Loneliness is a data point, not a verdict. The third is nostalgia. Nostalgia is a black sun disguised as a fireplace. It offers warmth that removes oxygen. Love the past, but do not let it assign your roots. Every craft needs a table of the smallest units. Here is a table you can learn by mouth and forget by hand until the hand remembers on its own. A minute is a seed. A route is a psalm. An anniversary is a lung. A name is a door. A map is a policy. A bell is a suggestion. A sky is a constitution. A ledger is an orchard if you plant it with weather. A rumor is a staircase. Count the steps before you decide which floor it wants. A correction is an apology that learned to eat breakfast. A decoy feast is a taxi. Ask who paid the fare. When doubt grows practical, consult the catechism you didn't know you wanted. What if moving the feast truly spares the bones of exhausted people? Then write the spared names, and write the late ones. Mercy survives a ledger. Management resents it. What if without gardeners the orchard dies? Garden in public, prune loudly, staple errata where children can reach. Keep cuttings of the wild for years when orchards forget Sunday. What if I am alone? Then you are quorum enough. Minutes kept by one witness age into policy when the tired arrive. What if I am late? Welcome. Lateness is proof you were not scheduled. What if my work is too small? Small is the size of breath, and breath is the unit of voices. The room where you stood proved that scale is not a moral category. It is a lighting choice. I owe you a confession that is not theatrical. I loved the clock without hands before I feared it. Its restraint felt religious. It taught me to admire smoothness, as if smoothness were virtue. A handless clock is the patron saint of curated hours. Breaking the glass did not liberate me from time. It liberated me from permission. Do not confuse the two. Schedule is a leash. Time is an ocean. Tide does not ask to ring. When the sky began to form a color it could live with, we reached the street where our rituals parted. She walked toward cartography because someone must admit how feet actually move. I walked toward the door that is not a door because absence is sometimes the only sermon a room deserves. I pressed my palm to the seam and left nothing on the stone except the heat of an ordinary hand. I want the room to miss me. Rooms should miss their witnesses sometimes. You ask that this last hour be longer, not by decoration but by mass. So I will continue until the text acquires the fatigue that proves it has walked. I will pile scenes the way a mason piles stones, each chosen for edge and plane, until the wall stands without argument. There is a schoolroom where a teacher is kind and tired and postpones questions to the end of class, and then the bell rescues both teacher and questions. The rescue is a theft, so polite neither notices. There is a workplace where the meeting always starts 5 minutes before the hour, so that late becomes the new on time. The minutes wrap themselves around the habit and harden into policy. There is a clinic where consent forms are written for eyes that slept badly, and signatures are schedules in disguise. Time is medicine here, and dosage is a bell. There is a newsroom where headlines wait until dinner, because rage sells more politely after dishes are washed. The appetite is not for truth, it is for pacing. You will be told you are being served. There is a choir that learns to inhale differently, so the hymn ends in the square just after the square was needed. The good voice is a velvet rope. There is a kitchen where a grandmother keeps two calendars, one from the parish office and one from the cupboard, and she cooks on both. The stew knows the correct day even if the newsletter learns something else. There is a bus route that changed for construction and never changed back. Tired feet do not file petitions. Tired feet walk. There is a museum that rearranges the order of rooms so you arrive at triumph before wound. The wound, demoted to the back, learns to whisper. The guard apologizes for the inconvenience of history and points to the cafe. There is a funeral scheduled at an hour that divides mourners from their shifts. Half the grief arrives in uniform later and keeps vigil outside the gate because the map on paper did not account for uniforms. None of these need villains. All of them require minutes. You can answer any of them with arrival. Arrive at the old hour and greet whoever arrives because you arrived. Arrive one stanza early and let your own voice be the metronome for a space. Do not insist, only continue. Arrive with bread instead of argument. Arrive with a pencil behind your ear and a pocket that carries a folded page with two shelf numbers. The one that was, the one that is. Arrive with your phone turned off for 1 noon each week, and let the sky teach you the hour. Your neck will know. Arrive at the library's wrong aisle, and look for a stool that isn't in the report. Stand on it. Take the book down as if you had permission. Put it back with gratitude. Permission grows where gratitude is practiced. If you are tempted to make a banner, draw instead a small map of wherever you are and mark 2 doors, the one you were told to use and the one you prefer. Carry the map, fold it until the creases teach your fingers, then give it to someone younger with the instruction that is not an instruction. Decide with your shoes. If you are tempted to form a movement, form instead a guild of minutes. Meet monthly, swap routes, trade errata, bring bread, bring weather, bring gossip, only if the gossip includes times and distances. The absence of names will keep you honest. The presence of clocks will keep you precise. There will come a day when the gardeners admit a mistake in public. They will call it an update. They will say the word transparency as if it were a sacrament, and they will pour it into microphones. Accept the change and ignore the performance. Clip the notice. Pin it next to the old date. Read it aloud at the square they forgot. The point is not humiliation. The point is habituation. Make honesty ordinary and spectacle bored. I have left out miracles on purpose. If you need one, a child will ask why the river is called by 2 names. Answer, because rivers keep secrets for people who walk. And if the child asks what the secret is, answer by walking. If the child insists on a sentence, give them the smallest one that can hold. Time without permission. Then let the child fill it with neighborhoods. Good night is a phrase that assumes a bell. Good now refuses the bell its last dignity. So good now, carry questions in a sleeve like contraband daylight. Take the long way when the short way is paved with apologies. Read errata aloud, where rooms cannot schedule your voice. Teach a name a map forgot, until the mouth remembers it without your help. Keep a calendar that rings without bells and share the ring the way you share bread. Do not stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing to them is memory waking up, and the good news disguised as trouble is that waking requires no license. The sky is already on your side. Listen to the air between bells and wind. It is telling the time.